I grew up in a Christian household. In fact, my father was the priest. And so every Sunday I would sit with my mother and my two brothers, and we would always be 3 rows from the front on the right-hand side over against the wall every single Sunday. An hour in church, and then an hour in Sunday school after church. And after a while, you sort of get the lingo down. Doesn't mean you understand it, but at least you get all the words pretty good. And so I got all the lingo down, and I would listen to my dad Sunday by Sunday as he would preach. And one Sunday he said, well, you know, if there is anything about Christianity, you might just want to share it with somebody. You might want to talk about your faith to somebody else. I remember it very clearly. I was, I think, probably about 12 years old. And I picked out my target. My target was one of my former babysitters. I always loved it when she came to babysit. She was such fun. She would let us do all kinds of things that my parents would never allow us to do. And you know how young boys can get crushes on their babysitters. So here, many years after she had stopped babysitting, if I was 12, she was probably in her mid-20s or so. And our families got together that week, and I saw her, and I decided, well, she was the one that if we were to share our faith with somebody, she would be the one that I would share my faith with. So in my 12-year-old wisdom, I sort of hitched myself up and looked her in the eyes and said, I'm a Christian, you know. And she smiled politely and said, yes, I know. And I said, well, are you a Christian? And she said, well, no, I'm not. And I said, well, you should be a Christian. And she said, well, why don't you tell me what you believe as a Christian? And I thought, okay, good. I've got all this down. I know what I'm going to say. And I talked about Jesus as being the Son of God and coming to earth and dying on the cross and saving people from their sins. And I just felt so good about myself. I thought, I nailed it. I was not ready for the response that I was going to get. This 20-something-year-old looked me in the eyes and said, that's such a crock. She said, really? A parent would condemn their only child to an absolutely preventable death in order that people who hadn't lived up to a whole bunch of arbitrary laws that this guy set up in the first place, you want me to worship that? That's crazy. I remember this stinging sensation in the whole of my body as I went completely numb and had nothing to say. St. Paul, in our first reading this morning, talks to the church at Corinth. And he gives them a word that says, such things just might happen, you know. St. Paul, as he writes, said, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. It sure seemed like foolishness to the people that I tried to talk to. It also seemed like foolishness to the people of St. Paul's day, the religious authorities of the day. For them, the cross of Christ was ridiculous. They had studied Old Testament scriptures, and they knew of the scripture that said, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. And they said, if there's one thing that absolutely proves that this could not be God's chosen one, It is that he died on a cross. To the Greeks in the area, they too saw this as ludicrous. You see, to the Greeks and their understanding of God, the one quality or characteristic that God had was what's known as apatheia, or close to our term of apathy. Apathy meaning, in their words, that God could never be moved. And so for the Greeks to say that people could actually move God, that would mean that people were more important than God or more powerful than God. How could that be? That God could suffer? That God could die? It was foolishness. The cross was a scandal. They said, surely no thinking person could ever believe in something like that. Well, St. Paul, in that reading from this morning, talks about the fact that in the cross there is a paradox. A paradox is where we put two things together that seem to be absolutely contradictory to each other. But when we put them together, we can see that there actually is an element of a deeper truth in the midst. And so St. Paul talks about the paradox of wise foolishness and of weak strength. People of his generation, for sure, had their idea what was wisdom, how to make good decisions, how to weigh out all of the choices that they had in life. And God comes along and says, put all of your wisdom aside, because my wisdom is not the same as your wisdom. People of the day also had an idea of what power is and what strength is. And God said, put aside all your ideas of what power is and what strength is, because I'm going to show you true power by having the Messiah die on a cross. That's power. It was so confusing. People just couldn't get it. They had their own ideas of strength, wisdom, power. And God's standard was just throwing them off entirely. And it was all about the cross. Why the cross? What would have been different if Jesus had lived to 91 years old and died in his sleep at the Happy Trails nursing home? What would have been different? Everything. Absolutely everything would have been different. Because it was Jesus' voluntary going to the cross. That he didn't have to. He could have said no, but he chose to go to the cross that something might change in all of humanity. What is it? What is it that changed? What is it about the cross that absolutely transformed humanity? Well, there are a whole bunch of $50 words that theologians would use of atonement and justification and propitiation and sanctification and glorification and all kinds of things that I'm sure they have great meaning to somebody, but for most of us, they kind of, what? But there is something in the cross that makes a difference. Let me give you a couple of models that may help us understand. The problem with every model is every model will have its strengths and its weaknesses, the truths that it will proclaim and the truths that it doesn't, where it's inadequate. One of the models is what I would call the pawn shop model. You know what a pawn shop is. You have something that's valuable to you, but you're a little short of cash. And so you take it to the pawnbroker and you hawk it. And then you come back maybe 6 months later and want to buy back what you had at a somewhat inflated price from what they gave you for it in the first place. There is something like that about the cross and the gospel, where humanity was one of God's treasured possessions. But as a result of Adam and Eve and sin entering the world and every human being since then sinning, because of sin, we became the property of the devil, who said, okay, you want them back, you got to pay a price. You're not getting these folks back for free. And so Jesus paid the price at the pawn shop so that we could be released. We could be set free. Well, there's another model, the judicial model. The judicial model is we stand before a judge, and the judge looks us in the eyes and says, are you guilty? And we say, absolutely. We know we're guilty. The judge is about to pass sentence. And as he is passing sentence, someone in the courtroom stands up and says, I'll take that sentence. Let this one go free. I'll serve the jail time on behalf of another. And the judge bangs the gavel and says, done. You go free. You go to jail. Or there's what I would call the role model model. The role model is looking at the life of Jesus as one that we can emulate, that we can look up to. We all need heroes in our life. Somebody that did it right. Somebody that we can say, I want to pattern my life after that one. And part of what Jesus did was to go through life facing every single temptation and never giving in. And the biggest temptation of all, was to save his own life. To make an idol, if you will, of his life. To say that his life was more important than following God's way. And he said, actually, no. I'm not going to make an idol out of my life. I'm not going to let it stand in my way with God. I will give up even my life. So that for us, we can follow that model and say, even in our time and in our day, we don't have to fall into temptation. God is there to offer us strength, wisdom, power to be able to overcome temptation, just as he did through Jesus. Each of the models, well, they have their own strengths and weaknesses. Well, there is one more model. The other model is the Whitney Houston, Kevin Costner, bodyguard, I'll take a bullet for you model. But we'll leave that one alone. Each of the models has an element of truth. The pawn shop model says there really is evil in the world. I don't want to give a picture of what I think evil, Satan, the devil is, but I want to say that if I can believe in a loving God, I can also believe in a devil that tries to frustrate all that God tries to do. I don't have any trouble with that. The second model, the judicial model, I think it teaches us that God really does stand for what's right. I think sometimes we see God as some kind of cosmic marshmallow that just loves everybody no matter what, and there is no consequence, and you're all fine and wonderful. Yeah, part of that's true, but the way God can do that is because he stands against sin and doesn't want us to sin and wants to release us from that sin. The third model, the role model, I think the truth in that is to say there is something in our part that's necessary, in that we do have to resist evil. We do have to stand for what is right. We do have to look at all that Jesus did and say, under God's strength and power, I want to make those kind of choices as well. We cannot be, quote, saved as a burning building is saved, where the burning building doesn't have to do a thing. Just people come along and put the fire out and that burning building is saved. No. We have to be saved through choices that we make, decisions, daily. Well, Paul said the cross is foolishness to those who are around us. They don't get it. I understand that. People that I would talk to, I don't think they would get the subtleties, the paradoxes of the gospel. I don't think we are ever going to be able to use logic to talk somebody into the kingdom by explaining to them the power of the cross. Maybe we can, but I don't think we can be able to talk them into the kingdom. However, may we be able to lead lives that have been touched by the crucified one, to receive the grace, the power, the forgiveness that comes. May others see in our lives the power of God to save. And maybe they won't be turned through our logic, but may they be turned through our lives. Amen.